Welcome to the EO Podcast with Bret Keisling, part of the EO Podcast Network.
Hello, my friends. Thanks for listening. My name is Bret Keisling, and as it says on my business cards, I'm a passionate advocate for employee ownership. I am so delighted to be joined today by Gina Schaefer. If you follow employee ownership at all, chances are you've seen her on social media or as the keynote at a NCEO conference. She's a frequent speaker. She's an author. She is the founder and chairperson of the board and retired CEO of a few cool hardware stores that is just about 3 years old as an EsOp. She is a board member at CCA Global Partners, and she's a greeting card maker. The Renaissance woman of employee ownership, Gina Schaefer, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Bret.
I really appreciate it quite a bit. You're one of these folks that in your 3 years, and suddenly it makes sense. I was wondering how suddenly you were just everywhere in our mutual orbit online, and you were commenting and speaking and doing keynoting. And I was like, where did you come from? And then I came to understand a few cool hardware stores is only 3 years old as an EsOp. And so you literally, in our world, in EO world, kind of have just been a relatively recent addition.
Popped up. Yeah, every time you join a new network, you find all of these new friends or podcasts or associations or people that you never knew existed that you should probably be involved with. And I wish I had known before. And so when we started exploring the EsOp opportunity, I was introduced to people like you and other resources that are all brand new.
Well, I appreciate it. And before we get into it, one of the things that I admire and respect quite a bit about you is you're a little bit prolific, if that's not overstating it, on LinkedIn. You make a lot of comments, but it's all very positive. You are as supportive and a positive a person, whether it's nice things you said about me in the podcast before we talked, others in the employee ownership field, or I get these messages, Gina Schaefer has reposted or commented on something not related to EO. And I don't think I've ever seen you take a cranky view on everything. You're just very supportive and positive.
I was accused years ago, and I use the word accused lightly, of leading by cheerocracy. And what someone was sort of snarkily trying to say to me is that you are always positive, but I think it was the biggest compliment I've ever gotten in my life. I want to support everyone starting something, everyone running something, everyone championing small businesses or women in business, young people in business, anyone in business, frankly, who is doing something different, out of the ordinary, that needs the support. None of us will grow or thrive unless we're tooting our own horns and someone else is willing to toot along with us. And so I really appreciate that you noticed that and that you think it's a big deal.
I do indeed think it's a big deal, and we need more of it. And, to be honest with you, one of the things that resonates with employee ownership for me is it's one of those few bipartisan issues, if not the only one, where people who disagree on literally everything can get together and have an agreement that employee ownership can change our country and communities, et cetera. So the positivity is our country is worse off that there aren't more people like you. So I do appreciate it. Gina, as you know, we like to start the episode, and there's so much we want to talk about. We want to talk about your EsOp journey. We want to talk about your book. We want to talk about anything else that you would like to talk about. But we do like to start the episodes with the EO aha moment. And it's not the moment where you first heard about employee ownership or thought it might be positive, but a moment that made you really stop and go, this could be transformative. Have you had an EO aha moment you'd like to share?
Yes, I have. And I'm so happy that you asked this question. So in 2021, when protests were happening all over the country, mainly because of political unrest and all the things that were going on at the time during COVID, the protests in Washington, D.C. most of them started just north of where my office was before I retired. And they walked down 14th Street in Logan Circle. And I have this amazing picture of the streets just full of people protesting. And I was hanging out my window in my office to take this photo. And my husband came to me one day and he said, I think we should walk out into the street with our teammates, which is what we call our employees, and any customer in the store who wants to walk in solidarity with us. And we closed the store door and we walked outside and we realized that a small business like ours could change generational wealth. We could change all of the inequalities that were happening in the world that people were protesting against if we formed an EsOp for our business. And that was it. That was my EsOp aha moment.
Wow. So you took, and in the interest of full disclosure, Gina, and I don't generally, as I said, do politics on the podcast because you're going to make 50% of the people cranky, in this way. I spent 17 or 18 days in Washington, D.C. in 20 and early 21, much to my, as somebody who spent most of my life is fiscal conservative, social liberal, that trope, but as a business person, et cetera, et cetera. 2020 turned me into both a protester and a counter-protester and was called to spend a lot of time down there. And I never made the connection between that and you taking a real step as a business owner and leading it on your path to employee ownership. That's very powerful.
Well, so one of the quotes in my book that I love is, I always wondered when somebody was going to do something about that, and then I realized I was somebody. And if you take that to the most basic level, at least how I think about it, everybody seems to be waiting for something to happen and someone to do something about it. What is it? Who is somebody? And that quote made me realize that no matter who we are, we can be somebody and do something. And for us, for my husband and I, at that moment in time, we could do something about what the protesters wanted. What they wanted, or what we all wanted, was income equality, gender equality, racial equality, generational wealth saviors, solutions. But I think a lot of people think as a small business owner that there's nothing we can do. We're too tiny. We don't have enough money. The big guys are always better this, more of that. And it was a real hit over the head. We had always done a lot, I think, as a small fry. And I always thought we could do more, but that was a real pivotal moment for us when I realized that we could even do more, say more, be more than we were giving ourselves credit for. And I wanted to invite other people to do the same thing. I think we get complacent, or we're afraid that we can't do something to make a bigger impact. And we could. And what we did was to create an ESOP that allowed, out of the day we announced, 165 of our teammates, of the 300 that we have, immediately became owners in our company. And that was a really big deal.
There are generally buckets of answers that I've discovered, and we probably have about 100 EO aha moments from guests through the last 4 or 5 years. And there are buckets that they generally fall into. Yours is unique. Yours stands alone. And the tie-in with everything that's going on in the country at the time, and still is in many respects. But it is reminiscent of, there are folks who are with the organizations, they are advocates. And every so often, some of the aha moments reflect where I was looking at societal ills and solutions, often in an academic setting, but we're looking for solutions that worked, and EO checked the boxes. And in many ways, your moment fits into that, except it literally was while boots were on the ground. And by the way, for folks who haven't, I can't imagine what it was like. There were 3 specific times that I felt called to go to Washington and had the ability to do it. One was regarding the George Floyd matters. The other was I went down to D.C. election day. I voted and then drove to D.C. and decided that I was going to stay there until the election was called, which was 7 days or 6 days. And then I was back on January 5th, 6th, and 7th to express my displeasure with the people who rioted at the Capitol, et cetera, et cetera. And to have been there and living there and being in the midst of it was very powerful, because you were an eyewitness on a daily basis to history in our country.
Yeah, I wasn't actually here on January 6th, but right now I live 5 blocks from the Capitol. And regardless of whether or not I was in town that day, this is my town. And a lot of people just think of it as a capital city where the federal government lives, but people live here. And so it's very personal for those of us who live here, because it's kind of like being invaded. And I think we're going to get off topic, so I'll stop right there. But I do appreciate people who came into town from other places, because you also clearly see it as a place where people live, and a capital, and a place you can, anyway, I'll stop.
Gina, there are so many cool aspects to your story that there are many places that we could go to, but I guess let us start. And if you can, I do want to talk about the voyage to employee ownership. But can you perhaps give us a thumbnail view of when you formed it to now, the number of locations, and you are a year ago in July of 23, you retired as the CEO. So can you just kind of give us a snapshot of a few cool hardware stores?
Sure. So I opened the first location in 2003. The neighborhood actually where that store is was destroyed by the riots when Martin Luther King was assassinated. So not to bring up the last topic again, but there is a history which also fed into why those riots, those protesters, I'm sorry, made such a big impact on my heart because I knew what this neighborhood had gone through prior to me living here. So I opened my first location in 2003. The neighborhood was going through a huge renaissance. I spent the next 20 years, opening 15 locations, opening 10 and buying 5. With my husband, he joined me after I opened that first location. He came home one day, he said, "You're having too much fun. Can I work with you?" And so we've been great life partners and business partners ever since. So we grew for 20 years. That 2021, when all of that started to happen, I had already started thinking about what my exit strategy should be. I was ready to step down as CEO. I thought that the business just, they were ready for new blood. I absolutely love what I'm doing and I still love the team, but I wanted to do some new things. And the opportunity to really evaluate what our exit strategy was going to look like, what that succession plan was going to be. You know, hardware stores are very multi-generational. I did not inherit the business from a father or mother or grandparents. So I didn't have that expectation, but that also meant that I didn't have that opportunity. And so I had to really soup to nuts look at the entire landscape of business succession and figure out what was going to make sense for us. And you know what that means. I mean, it's private owner, it's transition to some employee who could buy it, it's private equity, it's selling it to another hardware chain. I mean, we had lots of options, with an ESOP being one of them. And so I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's the very quick how we got started, 20 years. We had a lot of interesting growth over the years. So 2 of our stores had to close, which could be a topic for another conversation, but they didn't work. And so that kind of challenge or failure, or however you want to categorize it, is always in the back of my mind because we do want to continue to grow. But now, especially as we're in ESOP, it's not that we wanted to fail before, but now I'm very cognizant of, if we choose this location, is it going to be a benefit for my co-owners, the employee owners? So 5 of them we purchased from selling owners. And so we were actually the succession plan for 5 of the owners that we purchased from. So we still have a little bit of a more opportunity of that, to do that kind of thing. But 10 of them were ground up, brand new stores.
I love that. And they tend to be in a urban environment, which is not, at least for me, the hardware store conjures almost rustic and, grandpa and multi-generational families there. And this seems it would have a completely different vibe.
When I started, I had this, an older hardware store owner. He came up to me at a conference and he said, "I don't get it. What do people in the city need at a hardware store?" And I'm not very good at not emoting, so I'm sure I laughed. And I said to the man, "My house has 3.5 toilets." Like, I was living in a big house in the middle of the city at the time. I said, "I need a lot of things from the," "What do you mean? What do we need?" I think there's this concept of, we all live in apartments that we don't do anything to, perhaps, or there aren't any houses in the city. We all live in the suburbs and work in the city. Certainly, again, going back to this being a federal district. And so I think there was this notion for a lot of people that inner city did not have any reason to shop at a hardware store. In 1975, the Washington Post ran an article when I opened my first location that said in 1975, there were 75 hardware stores in Washington, D.C. And when I opened, there were less than 10. And of those 10, probably only 3 or 4 were really viable, open full time, members of a co-op with big buying power, that kind of thing. And so we were desperate for a local hardware store.
So just out of curiosity, you didn't come into this through family or a history, et cetera, et cetera. Why hardware?
I had moved to this neighborhood because it was the cheapest place in the city to buy that anybody sort of wanted to live in. It was still, there were a lot of boarded up buildings and
Right.
boarded up houses, and the retail corridor was empty. It had been abandoned after the riots in the 60s and it never came back. And so it was an inexpensive place to live. I moved here, and then Mark, my now husband, he got jealous and he moved here around the corner. And so we moved into this neighborhood together, and we got really involved in the local community association, which I was 27, I guess, at the time. So I grew up in a small town in Ohio. So I have very community-based roots in a small town, but I hadn't really experienced that as part of a city resident yet. But I got involved in this association, and we were all trying to eliminate crime and attract new residents, and talked about all of the businesses that we wanted. And everybody wanted a grocery store, a pharmacy, and a hardware store, which I think most communities still want on some level, or, in some way. We still hear that. And I was in the technology industry, and I was working for a company. It was 17 miles away, but it took me at least an hour to go back and forth. I really disliked that commute, and I got laid off.
Hmm.
And the day that I was driving home that I got laid off, I was trying to decide what I was going to do. It was my third layoff in about 4 years, because I was just part of this whole boom and bust of the tech 90s. And by the time I got home, I thought, you know what? There is no reason why I can't open a hardware store. That's what everybody wants. The neighborhood the year prior, 6 months prior, had gotten a grocery store and a pharmacy. So I didn't even have to think about those as potential options. I'm really glad. So that's why.
I love that. It is a mega example of, well, somebody's got to do it, so I'll do it. And you actually, this is what you were talking about. I absolutely love that. So we fast forward and you've done the stores, and just for those listeners, the employees are an ESOP. You are also connected through the Ace Hardware stores, which is a buying cooperative, not an employee cooperative.
Yeah, there are, most customers don't understand or don't know, think about it, but there are no hardware franchises in the United States. So if you want to open a hardware store, you either join a cooperative, you buy from a wholesaler, or you do some combination of the two. There is no franchise to join. And so we joined the Ace Hardware Cooperative when we opened that first store, and then each store joins as a member as we open it.
Excellent. That is very interesting. So 3 years into the ESOP, my friend Jesse Tyler, who hosts the Owner to Owner podcasts, where he is an employee owner, his guests are employee owners, they often talk about how long it takes employee owners to kind of get being an ESOP. And the consensus, I would say, from all of Jesse's conversations is 4 to 5 years. Some say people get it quick, and some people do get it quick. Others, it takes a while, but 4 or 5 years. How are you finding the transition to employee ownership going?
I think it's the easy way to answer is it's all over the place. Someone asked me recently, there are a lot of doubters. Isn't it expensive? Didn't it take a long time? Isn't it confusing? I mean, you've probably heard all of these questions before. And it occurred to me before a recent keynote that I gave that those doubters, at least in terms of the educational process, are missing the benefit. And the benefit is the more times you have to be in front of or communicate with your team, the better leader you can become. I mean, not everybody does. And so we took this opportunity to have even more conversations. We created quarterly Zoom calls so that anybody can call in from any location and ask questions. The newsletter has an ESOP category. I mean, all of the things that really good ESOPs are probably already doing, we are starting to learn. But the benefit was that I'm going to have to constantly be educating, or my team is constantly be educating the newcomers to the ESOP, because retail businesses we have very low turnover. We're very proud of that. But somebody new is always becoming a member. And so that gives you another opportunity to educate.
Those of us who play an advocate role for employee ownership, we talk about things, as you and I already have had, the effects on community, of the effects on societal issues that are important to us, that sometimes I think the collective, we forget the fact that it is, an ESOP is in its essence a retirement plan. And so ultimately, when Jesse's guests share their EO aha moments, I feel like I'm relying on my friend Jesse Tyler quite a bit, and the Owner to Owner podcast, which I will gratuitously plug at www.ownertoownerpodcast.com.
I need to meet Jesse.
I'm sorry?
I said I need to meet Jesse.
Oh, Jesse's great. And Jesse just presented in Tampa at the NCEO about doing podcasts. And Jesse's wonderful, and I hope you and the listeners will check it out. But when Jesse asks his guests their EO aha moments, the majority of them are when they or someone they worked with get their balance statement and it shows the money. So that's one of the challenges with newer ESOPs, that we can educate and we can talk about these terms, but nothing says it. And I don't say this cynically. It's a reminder that this is what we're about.
Yes.
What will change the lives of the employee owners, the generational wealth, is the funds that will come at retirement. First of all, for many, that's a long time away. But when you see these annual statements and, you, depending on how you set up the ESOP, nobody may be fully vested yet, depending on your specific terms, which means it's natural that it will take a little bit of time. Frustrating for those of us who want everybody to get it now, but it's very much natural.
Yeah, I mean, we had a 401k before we formed the ESOP. which is a little unusual for businesses like ours. And so we had spent years already trying to educate our team on what that means to have a retirement plan. And I mean, you sort of hinted at this, but when you join a company, it's your first job and you are the person making paint or the cashier or the plant guy. You're not thinking about retirement because you're too young. I mean, most of us don't until we need to. And even if you are, you might not quite understand what that means. And then you see this big chunk of money and you think, well, I want that now because that could change my life now. And so all of those things also factor in to creating some sort of educational path, because you want people to stay and you want them to see that grow for the moment when they're not going to be working anymore. It's challenging. All of those components make it challenging. I do like to tell a story, if you'll indulge me for a second. My grandmother, you mentioned earlier that you're curious, and I had this grandmother who I loved, but she always called me nosy. And I realized as a response to her calling me nosy, I went through this period of my life when I wasn't curious because I always felt like I was asking too many questions and that I might be insulting someone. So I was walking through my break room one day and I heard one of my teammates talking about running a race. I didn't think he looked like a runner. I very stereotypically thought, there's no way he's a runner. Well, long story short, he had been living on a park bench. He was homeless. And an organization called Back on My Feet here in Washington said, if you come to a meeting, we'll give you a pair of shoes. And he said, I was curious. And I was like, wow. Like, so the reason that it was really mind blowing is that it changed his life, him being curious about those shoes, because he went to that meeting and then the next meeting, and he became a runner. First he walked and then he jogged and then he became a runner. Well, the very first conversation that I got to tell this story after forming an EsOp, it occurred to me that he didn't just become a runner, he became an owner in my business. And he was 69 last year. And we made people, I think it's 63, and forgive me for not knowing the exact number, fully vested. And so when Mike retired, he went from living on a park bench to being fully vested as an owner in my company within a 10-year span. And it wasn't a life-changing amounts of money for most people, but it was life-changing for Mike. And I love thinking about that as a reason to tell these stories.
There is a powerful thread running through your narrative of wanting to do the right things for the right reasons, for the right people, which seems to be anybody who crosses paths with you is the right people. And it is absolutely powerful of his journey from homelessness to being an employee owner. And you layer in he was curious is great. And for the third and perhaps final time, I'll reference Jesse Tyler. 3 years ago, I wanted to start a podcast with, a host that was an actual employee owner. And I just put on LinkedIn, hey, if I produce a podcast, will anybody host as a volunteer? And, et cetera, et cetera. Neither of us make any money off of these efforts. We just love it. And Jesse sent me a message. He and I had met maybe once or twice at conferences or a couple of times and kind of knew who each other was. But Jesse, as he describes it, he just raised his hand. And now we're wrapping up season 3 with 70 episodes, and his work is incredible. So people who will stand up and volunteer or put themselves out there, you just never know the path that it's going to lead you to.
No idea. And you don't know unless you try. I mean, it sounds a little cliche, but it's absolutely true.
So layering in everything, Gina, you are an author, and your book ties in various themes of what is important in your life, from the business to other things, but recovery hardware is the topic of the book. We will include a link to where you can get the book in the show notes, and we'll have some other information about Gina as well. But tell me about recovery hardware.
So in 2014, one of my teammates, whose name is Mark, not my husband Mark, came to me and said the community where our store was had nicknamed us Recovery Hardware. And that was significant because so many of our teammates had come from a local recovery clinic called the Whitman Walker Addiction Services Program that was right down the street from our store. And when we opened that first location, there were a couple of things that we decided that we were not going to put any obstacles in front of employment, which was a pretty radical thought at the time. So here's a really strong example. At the time, it was still legal to have the felony box on the application. Whether you want to call me naive or stupid or short-sighted, or I've been called all of them, I thought that the felony box was a rude question. I distinctly remember thinking, this is rude, I'm not going to ask it. And I think a little bit of it was, I thought it was being nosy, honestly.
That's
And so,
very funny.
so we banned the box before we legally were required to ban the box. My very first teammate had been in prison for 17 years. And I didn't know that when I hired him. He didn't feel like he needed to tell me that. And then we got to know each other and he felt comfortable telling me that. And then he became part of our story. And he worked with us for almost 11 years. And had I asked him that question, I'd like to think I would have hired him anyway, but a lot of people wouldn't have. His application would have immediately gone in the trash. The second person who came to interview was 6 weeks clean from a crystal meth addiction. And anybody who's dealt with any kind of addiction knows that you are only what your next day gets you. And so it didn't matter really if it was 6 weeks or 6 months or 6 years. I mean, obviously. And he told me that. And I remember thinking, wow, that seems so honest. I'm so happy that this guy told me this. And I also said, I don't care. I don't care. And his story's more involved in that because I didn't hire him at first and then I did. But we are to this day friends. He's been clean for 21 years. He left, but when he left working with us, he started telling everybody else in the recovery rooms to go see that lady at the hardware store. And so he sent Skippy, who sent Brian, who sent another guy named Mark, and before we knew it, people were joking about having AA meetings in the plumbing aisle because we just had this wonderful community of people who, oh, by the way, also happened to be going to recovery meetings down the street. So to get back to your original question, my coworker, Mark, came to me and said, this is what the community is calling us. I sobbed because I thought it was such a beautiful nickname. People had been asking me for years to write a book about starting a hardware business, which I just frankly didn't think was an interesting enough topic for a book. And the second he said that, I said, that's not only the name, but I'm going to tell the stories of how we've done this to hopefully inspire other businesses to do something similar. And so that's how it started. I started writing it I wrote the first draft in 2020, January 2020, and published in September of 23, I think it was. Yeah, I think it was 22. And I've been talking about it ever since.
Well, first of all, it speaks to how you may be an overachiever because a number of people started writing during COVID. You got the book finished before COVID.
I started writing in 2020. So I started writing right before COVID hit, not knowing it was coming. And then I finished it. Yeah. It actually, just to tie the EO bow on it, when I started writing it, we hadn't decided that we were going to form the ESOP. And so that was never part of the original manuscript. And then when it was getting closer and closer to publishing time, we had decided to form the ESOP. And it was a beautiful way to say, this is where we started and this is how we're going to end. And end is not right because we're not ending, but yes.
It's funny when you said end, I was going so completely opposite of, oh my goodness, this is a great excuse to have an additional reprint, in a year or two, an updated version of how it's going now. Gina, what you're doing, and I would like to ask a couple of questions about it. What you're doing is so important and to share with, doesn't come up a whole lot in the podcast, but my recovery date is Memorial Day 1990.
Right on. Awesome. Awesome.
As you and I chat a little bit, it'd be dying. Why did I quit drinking? I had to. But, just a couple of examples that came to mind. You'd mentioned the felony box. It's been a while and I should probably get back into it, but used to be a regular blood donor. And I have the universal type that, is very tasty to everybody. And so they would call me up regularly and ask me to donate. And it was such a barrier, and I get it because of communicable diseases, but oh my goodness, just when you mention addiction, there were lots of barriers, insurance forms and that sort of thing. It can be such a barrier. And I've never really had the conversation. It's never really affected my employment. I've been self-employed the vast majority of what I'm doing, or I've gotten jobs because I've known the people and offers have been made, but it is very powerful. But risky, when you talk about someone who is relatively soon out of a meth addiction, and I say this very pragmatically and I'm very supportive, but, recovery doesn't take for everybody and it doesn't take that quick. It occurred to me, my recovery day is 1990. I was in rehab in 85. It took 5 years of going back out. And was it challenging? Were there challenges that being recovery hardware posed, or were there enough people in recovery? If you're having an AA meeting in the aisle, so to speak, it really sets a mindset. That is absolutely wonderful.
So this, the opposite of addiction is connection and community. And so what we had built was this really supportive community that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but that's the way life is with any kind of population that you're working with or any kind of, I once had a teammate say to me, Gina, wouldn't this business be a lot easier if you didn't have to have employees or customers? And I was like, why, yes, it would. So I think, we created, or I hope that we created, and it worked, a community of inclusiveness within the hardware store that allowed people to, if you were having a crappy day or you wanted to use and you were stressed or this, whatever it was, that you knew there was someone in the office who really understood what you were going through and or at least cared what you were going through. And so, I think a lot of employers say they want their employees to bring their whole selves to the office. Sometimes their whole self is messy. Sometimes my whole self is messy. And if we really want to practice what we preach, we have to allow that to happen. So, yeah, we had employees go back out. I had my heart broken. We had employees who stole things from us. But you know what? The employees who stole things from us were also not in recovery or had gone to college or had two supportive parents their whole lives. And if you were going to judge one group, as far as I was concerned, you had to judge them all. And we have examples of all of those things going awry. So I think really the connection that we made by building community in, and I think we also, I can think of one in particular sort of fail when it came to a hire that we had a manager. And the failure was because that manager just could not wrap his head around why it was a good idea to have this kind of philosophy. And I mean, clearly he just wasn't meant to be part of our business. And so when we started, so we opened the first store in 2003, and then we opened the second one exactly 2 years later in 2005. And the second store was managed by someone who had started at that first store. The third store was managed by someone in recovery who had worked at both. The fourth store was in Baltimore, so an hour away, scary for a new business owner, right? And I was still very green. He also was in recovery and had started at that second location. And so we created this, what we hoped was a foundation of morals, best practices, and just core values that each person was asked to take to the next place. And because they had lived it and benefited from it in a lot of ways, anybody, we wanted them to uphold those core values where they moved. And almost without a doubt, it did, without an exception.
I love that.
Yeah.
So there are challenges with folks who are in recovery. And as you pointed out, there were also really bad experiences with folks that weren't in recovery, so there's no monopoly on who's going to be the problems, employees will work or not. But it strikes me as I think about, the guiding principles, at least from an AA perspective, among them, everybody knows the first one, admit you have a problem, but some of the big ones are, living a life of rigorous honesty. And when you're wrong, promptly admit that. Not that those would be as listed in the ideals of employee-owned companies, but it seems to me the vibe of recovery, that I am a piece of something greater. One of the things that for a lot of people going into recovery is that you have to accept that there's a higher power because you're not the end all be all. And so there are things that they're not quite perfect fits, but they strike me as maybe kind of working well with the precepts of employee ownership.
Well, it goes back to the idea of the opposite of addiction being community or connection. I think that's exactly right. I mean, when you join a co-op or you're part of a co-op, it is not all about you. It's about your collective. I mean, I care about the other Ace hardware store owners in my region, whether they reciprocate that, but I care about them because they are part of this co-op ethos that I'm a part of. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, not only were we warmly welcomed at all of the EsOp conferences that we've gone to so far, because we're now part of that community, but I've realized that I want to extend that as part of the culture that we built so that my team understands it. I mean, frankly, brick and mortar stores are always under attack. And if I want this business to survive and thrive and grow, whether I'm at the helm of it or not, I have to make community at the center, and my team has to understand the community has to be at the center. And so, I told you how we started, what the neighborhood was like. Recovery throughout was on so many levels. The neighborhood recovered as we watched. I was a recovering tech reject. I found my voice. I found my place, my community and my own people. And then I happened to meet some really interesting folks who needed perhaps their own community or an extension of their community and brought them in. And really, I mean, my life is all the richer because of it, but wrapped around it is this beautiful sense of, so funny. I just thought of, why can't we all get along? Was that a book or something?
It was actually Rodney King in Los Angeles in 1992.
Oh God. Yeah, I mean, it sounds a little wishy-washy, kumbaya-ish, however you want to word it, but I think that I love the analogy that you drew, or the dotted line that you drew from an ESOP to people in recovery to just community in general.
One of the politicians in the last 20 years, and I think I know who said it, but one of the things that comes up from political leaders from time to time is the concept of self-made people, or there's really no such thing. And I thought, in the journey in my thinking, I thought in many respects that I was self-made, and, I entered recovery, and a couple of things I'd shared here, graduated law school at 42, et cetera, et cetera. And then when I cut through the hubris and realized, oh my goodness, there was such a network of family and friends and loved ones supporting me and making me able to do all of these self-made things, that I think it kind of fits in the vibe of what you're talking about, not just with employees who are in recovery or not, but there are some who think that they just need to succeed, and then there are others who have the vibe of, no, if we all succeed, we are all that much stronger. So obviously, as part of the ACE Hardware Network, of course, it is to your benefit if the ACE Hardware system is more robust, that you would benefit that as well. But it's also no skin off your nose supporting others. It's not like you're supporting the hardware store across the street. There's no harm in doing it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this goes back to me joking about the cheerocracy thing. I think that the more we elevate the voices of others and the success of others, I get so many accolades for it because I'm being nice to people, and that's my nature. I'm not doing it because I want people to say that, we're this amazing company. I'm doing it because I truly think here's a good example. When I was writing, I think I hit publish on Recovery Hardware, and people started saying, oh, are you going to write another book? I'm like, let me breathe let me recover from the first one. And so I always said no. It was, it was emotional, it was expensive, it was time consuming, certainly extremely gratifying. But people were asking me if I was going to write another one. Well, throughout the process of my book tour and promoting the book, I met or was introduced to or heard about beautiful companies all across the country who are doing very similar things. So I started keeping a list. So I have a list on my phone now of at least 20 companies, probably more, that do something similar. So then I started saying, well, if I write another book, I'm going to write about them. Like, I want the world to know they exist, because who's bragging about them? And maybe it's happening in their communities, but I'm so far removed, I have no idea. So maybe it's in me out there, but it would be because I want to elevate the stories of others.
So a lot of your efforts and a lot of your focus is on employee ownership, and you had done the keynote at NCO, I believe it was last year, as I mentioned. And generally, are there any themes that strike you as important or that kind of catch your attention now? Or are there any potential pitfalls? Like just kind of give us a brief state of VO in your view.
Well, I think so. I also gave a keynote recently at the Ohio Employee Ownership Conference, and it's one of the oldest networks in the country.
They are the oldest. I believe they were the very first one, and they led to Vermont, and
Yes.
now Steve Storkin is just doing amazing work. Yes. I had forgotten that, but yeah, absolutely. Yes. And that looked like that was a wonderful conference.
There were, I don't know, 400 to 450 people there. And it was a bit of a homecoming for me because I'm from Ohio, and it wasn't that far from where I grew up, and my parents got to come. And it was a big deal for me. I was so flattered to be asked. But then one of the things that oftentimes you don't want the keynote speaker to talk about the thing because they know the thing, right? I wasn't on stage as an ESOP expert because there were ESOPs in the room that had been ESOPs for 50 years. Right. I knew nothing compared to most of the folks. But one of the things that is still fresh for me is what is hard about it, what the naysayers think. And we talked about this earlier. Was it expensive? Was it time consuming? Whatever. And then what was hard and what are your ongoing challenges? And so I really talked a lot about building a strong culture and some of what's required to do that, dropping in the fact that, let's layer on the challenges of owning a business to now we all own the business and every day somebody new becomes an owner. How do we handle that? What does that look like? And now that I've transitioned out, what do I expect the new CEO to do? Because he's not me. And this was new for him. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think both of those opportunities at NCEO and at the OEOC gave me an opportunity to really think about what was hard for me, what I'm looking forward to, and what to tell people who are uncertain or doubtful about the process.
Boy, that, we've mentioned several times, but that would make a great episode in and of itself. The pitfalls, and really oftentimes it's overcoming misperceptions.
Exactly.
The reality is, yes, there's a certain level of complication to the transactions, but it would be the same with any transaction, et cetera, et cetera. So any plans to, if you don't mind me asking, are there any plans? You're currently at 30% as an ESOP. Do you anticipate that expanding at some point?
Yeah, so the goal is 100%. And, we want to make sure that the business remains cash flow positive and in a really good place financially. We will probably sell the next piece in about 2 years. That's our hope. Keeping in mind, well, one, we bank with National Cooperative Bank, and they're amazing. And not only do they understand cooperatives, but they understand ESOPs. We will expect them in the next year or two to fund a new location for us. And so, this is a balancing act for us because we're still fairly small. But we'll sell the next piece, hopefully in the next 2 years, and then we'll evaluate when the next after that. I think we expected it to be a 7 to 10 year transition. I would love it if it was faster, just because, not for any particular reason, but I don't think it will be any faster.
I did a number of transactions as an ESOP trustee. I think 4 or 5 dozen companies transitioned where I was the trustee for it. And there are very valid reasons to do it in steps, and logistics of the deal sometimes, personal needs of the selling shareholders. And if they built the company, that is certainly valid, et cetera, et cetera. At a certain point, my hesitation and discomfort was always we're just going to do this to try and kick the tires a little bit and see how it goes. Right. And at a certain point, my preference is for majority ESOPs, and I feel this is very gratuitous. It's not my place to tell you, but in terms of communication, with the owners, the fact that they're a 30%, sometimes comes into play, whereas if they're a majority or, majority or more. But I love that your goal is to eventually hit the 100% ESOP, because to me, that's just where the sweet spot is. And I think that is very cool. So Gina, by way of working towards wrapping up, do you want to share some closing thoughts with us?
I have so many, meaning that we could talk about this topic for 7 hours. I think that, no, I won't get into the subtopics that popped into my head, but I will say that if your listenership if they're an ESOP adjacent, let's just call them that, and they want to continue to explore this, that I am happy to have that conversation as a very, in a way, non-partial, but I did all of the succession planning evaluations. I thought about it from an emotional standpoint as the founder. I thought about it from I could sell it fast and get out. I thought about it from my employees' standpoint, who I have the utmost respect for and want to create this generational wealth opportunity for them. I want to be able to have all of those conversations with people who are interested. And so that's probably the thing that I would end with. And then I'll always talk about hardware stores.
I love that. I have enjoyed this so much. And, it's kind of funny because you were talking about that. It's almost like, it's not that you're very partial, but it's not from a fiduciary or pecuniary interest. You don't make money off of somebody, to some extent, somebody becomes employee owned. It's of no moment to you personally whatsoever, but it's a sign of your faith and belief in the process and the potential that makes you willing to speak to people. And I hope that people will reach out to you and ask the questions.
I'd be happy to answer them. I mean, we call ourselves unicorns, right? There's only 6,000 ESOPs in the country at this point, and there are so many businesses that have the potential, particularly with the coming baby boomers retiring. And so the more we talk about it, the more opportunity we have to increase the number of unicorns in the United States.
And to the extent, Gina, it would seem to me that, we know that there are companies that transition to employee ownership, and sometimes the challenge is a little bit more daunting because it's a complete turnaround in the culture.
Yes.
But then there are other companies, and a few cool hardware stores strikes me as the epitome of this. You had an EO vibe perhaps before you had even heard of employee ownership.
Absolutely.
The fundamental important things to employee ownership were already important to you. So if you're a cool company, if you're focused on truly your employees and your community, and you realize that it is fine to make a good living or a very good living, but that's not the end all be all, then following in your footsteps would be a very good path to take.
Yes, I totally agree with you.
Gina, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to get to know you a little bit. I suspect that there will be future conversations, and you're right, there are just so many topics that I would love to hear you opine on. So just thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you, Bret. I appreciate it.
With that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the EsOp podcast. My special thanks to Gina Schaefer. Check out her book in our show notes, Recovery Hardware. And as always, thank you so much for listening. This is Bret Keisling. Be well.
We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Facebook at EO Podcast Network and on Twitter at EsOp Podcast. This podcast has been produced by Bret Keisling for the EO Podcast Network. Original music composed by Max Keisling and marketing by Bitsy Plus Design. And I'm Bitsy McCann.